Welcome to Global Conversations here on Carib Explorer Television. I am your host, Ian Boxill. Global Conversation is a program that discusses global issues through Caribbean lenses. Now, recently, the world has witnessed a number of coups in West Africa. During the course of this year, there was a coup in Niger and later in Gabon. While there are questions about the nature of the coup in Gabon, the one in Niger seems to share some similarities with those in Mali and Burkina Faso, insofar as they appear to have strong mass support and are said to be aimed at ending the dominance of France in these countries. Following the coup in Niger, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of the West African States, imposed sanctions on the country, and they have even threatened to invade, ostensibly with the support of France and other Western powers, in order to restore President Mohamed Bazoum to power. This situation has resulted in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso signing an agreement for a mutual defense pact, which establishes the alliance of Sahel states. What are the implications of these coups for governance in Africa? Specifically, what do they say about developments in countries that were former colonies of France in Africa? Does an emerging multipolar world make it easier for such coup leaders to succeed in reshaping their countries? These and other issues will be the focus of today's discussion and Global Conversations here on Carib Explorer TV. Now, to help me discuss these issues are co-hosts Akeem Wade and Andrew McDaniel, both of whom are postgraduate students at the University of the West Indies here in Jamaica, studying international relations and political science, respectively. We will also be joined by two political scientists, one from Ghana and the other one from Jamaica. But first to my co-hosts and to Andrew. Andrew, what is your take on the recent coup in the Sahel region?
African democracy has always been a touchy subject, or democracy anywhere at all in Africa. I think, gentlemen, what we're witnessing now is really the elements of decolonization that was promised in the 1950s and the 60s, really showing its legs now. Because the truth is, in the African states, they were promised political autonomy during the 50s and 60s. But there were too many colonial remnants. And when I say remnants, I mean the foreign troops, the European powers, European businesses. They still had too much of an active role in African politics. And I think the poor leadership, the poor judgment, and the uneven, or should I say unfair, bilateral trade agreements established between these powers and these African states have really led to rising tensions that we're witnessing now in the Sahel region. So I think it's no coincidence that, most of the coup d'etats that we've seen in recent times are from Francophone African states, or, former France colonies. So, and France would have played an active role in terms of business and investments and mining and so on. So I think these coup d'etats are really the result of resistance or surgence of African nationalism or nationalism across the continent. So it's not the first and it's not the last one that we'll be seeing in a while.
Okay, Akeem, do you share this view or do you have a different opinion on the matter?
Oh, I completely agree. I think these coups, they're profound in two regards. One of which, it just really demonstrates the ugly aftermath of centuries of colonialism in many of these countries, which has led to long periods of economic instability, political instability, social instability. So I believe that these coups are just one instance of the African people finally speaking out against, the aftermath of colonialism. And it also demonstrates the fact that, it also demonstrates the fatigue that the African people have with many of the leaders who don't serve their interests, many of these leaders who are propped up and supported by the French government, so not only the French governments, but other governments in the West, specifically because these leaders who don't serve the interests of their people serve the interests of the West. So it demonstrates that that the people of Africa, many of whom are former French colonies, are fed up with the current state of African politics and are taking active steps to remove their oppressive leaders who don't serve their interest at all.
Okay, but both of you have read the situation as a sort of a process, continuing process of decolonization.
Yeah.
If that is the case, then how do you read the action of ECOWAS, which attempts to, in one regard, reinstate a democratically elected government? The case of Niger is an example.
Yeah.
How do you read that?
I think you can never remove economics from politics. And a big part of the uprisings in the Sahel states, or in Central Africa with Gabon, is a part of the business ownership in these states. And we know that France has a very large part to play in the mining sector, especially in Burkina Faso and in Mali. So when we look at ECOWAS more so is trying to maintain these relationships and these agreements between the European powers, and they gain from maintaining certain currencies and certain foreign direct investments in these African states. So democracy is the preferred, I should say, style of governance for these European powers, these Western countries as they've been before. But it's interesting looking at democracy in Africa because these military juntas, as they are, have legitimacy more than the democratically elected officials in Africa. Right?
Okay, how do you arrive at that? I mean, how do you arrive at they have greater legitimacy?
The popular support. I mean, on record,
Yeah.
on record, of course, you know, you have the political leaders who were voted in, and I say voted in quotations because, of course, the election has been marred with different, let me say, barriers and so on and so forth. But the popular support in the media, based on these coups d'etats and these uprisings of the military junta, you'd expect the public to be outraged of an undemocratic government or somebody who wasn't elected, but that's not the case. Persons are celebrating the uprising, so that should tell you all you need to know about it. Eh?
Exactly, and it does, in my opinion, sort of beg the question as to why Western countries, why do they not support these rebellions? Because it's seemingly an overthrow of leaders who do not meet the interest of the people. I mean, one of the most fundamental tenets of democracy, which is espoused by the West, is the social contract, leading by the will of the people. And it's clear that these leaders do not lead by the will of the people. Many of these countries many of these governments are high in corruption. I believe Niger ranks 150 out of 200 on the World Corruption Index. Electoral freedom. Many of these elections, for example, in Gabon has been ruled by two people in the last 50 years with regularly scheduled elections. So these are tenets that are traditionally championed by the West in wherever. So it really leads me to wonder why they don't support these uprisings, because these uprisings champion everything that is cherished by the West.
If I may, I think the reason why they don't support it is because these uprisings tend to affect business relationships.
Exactly.
You know, these uprisings are asking for French troops to leave the region, and these uprisings are asking for the French to have a smaller role to play in investment in the country, especially in the mining sector, that we think is a big issue for human development.
Relationship between the two nations.
Definitely.
Okay, well, we'll hear more about this. We are all across the Atlantic, and but I think we can hear more about this from an expert in the field, a political scientist, who will be joining us in a minute. And we will talk to him more about what is happening in the Sahel region. So I think he's on at the moment. We are joined by a lecturer in the Department of Politics at the University of Ghana, Dr. Charles Amo Ajiman, and he is in the space, he occupies the space, so I guess he knows more about what is happening. Charles, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you are on the ground there in Ghana, And obviously, Ghana has been one of the players in ECOWAS, along with Nigeria and the other powers in that area, who have governments that have indicated a certain level of displeasure with what has been happening in Niger. What is your position with respect to the coup? And secondly, can you give us a feel of what Ghanaians feel about what has been happening to your neighbors?
Okay, so first of all, I am not surprised at all. I mean, similarly, many Ghanaians and many West African, countries are not surprised at all about the coup, because the coup was in the air, and anybody who was a close watcher of what was going on clearly is not surprised at all about the coup. But with respect to ECOWAS and what they are doing, no one is scared of any West African leader. We are not afraid of that. And so, to sum it up, we are not in any way enthused about the decision of ECOWAS to go to war. Ghanaian soldiers are not prepared to go to war. Ghanaian MPs will never sanction it. And in fact, Ghanaians are also angry about the lawlessness of the ECOWAS leaders. You cannot intervene, by using force in Niger without a recourse to UN Security Council's, charter. And they should know that. So why would they want to go and intervene in Niger without recourse to the UN Security Charter? Ghanaians, and for that matter, West African countries are not enthused about the work of ECOWAS, and ECOWAS does not represent West African countries. They represent themselves, they represent their own belly, they represent their own selfish interest, and therefore, we are saying that the best option is to use diplomatic means in trying to diffuse the tensions in either in Mali or Niger or Gabon or any part of Africa.
So how do you respond to the view expressed by France that they have a difficulty with dealing with a regime that has overthrown a democratically elected president, and hence it is problematical for them to continue a conversation while they have their president locked up in Niger. How would you respond to that view, that a democratically elected government overthrown the junta should not immediately gain legitimacy?
But what is democratic about in Niger? There's nothing, there's no semblance of democracy in Niger. Is democracy about tear gassing demonstrators? Is democracy about imprisoning viable opposition leaders? There's nothing, there's no semblance of democracy in Niger. In fact, democracy in Niger is a sham. So to start with, there's no democracy to start with. And if these people are democratic, they are only neo-colonial democratic dictators. That's what they are, and therefore, for me, France is wrong in the first place in describing them as being, Democrat. They are not. They are not.
Okay, so if you were to summarize a takeaway, one or two takeaways from what has been happening in the Sahel region recently, what would be your two important takeaways? One for Africa and two for the world, and I would say three for people of the Caribbean who are across the Atlantic and who are watching.
Okay, so first and foremost, I would say that democracy has failed Africa. Democracy has abysmally failed in Africa. Democracy has not been able to deliver. The dividends of democracy have not been felt in Africa. For me, I think that democracy is not necessarily about every 4 years going to join a queue and put in a piece of paper in a box. Democracy should be able to improve the living conditions of the people. Democracy should be able to bring up changes in the people. Democracy should bring about employment. It should bring about providing public services and so on and so forth. My takeaway is that we need to break this vicious cycle of coup d'etats in Africa. Africa has had its own share of coup d'etats way back in the 1960s, in the post-colonial era. What I would say is that progressive thinkers in Africa, progressive thinkers in the continent should begin to think about how they can transform these popular mass support for coup d'etats into, a democratic mass expression of the people. In other words, what model can we choose in terms of governance? I'm not sure that we can go back to the discredited, Western model again. But I'm saying that the juntas are enjoying popular support. They are enjoying mass support. They are singing for them. Is there any way that we can, harness it? Is there any way we can transform that kind of mass support and mass, support? Mass support for these juntas and transform them into somewhat, mass democratic expressions of the ordinary people. And again, to the rest of the world, the democracy that they sold to Africa is not working. The democracy that they sold to Africa has failed Africa. And therefore, Africa should begin to domesticate democracy and use democracy the way that it will fit in African context.
Okay. Quite a bit for us to chew on there and to hear from someone who is close to the action. We will continue to monitor what has been happening, but in the meanwhile, we would like to thank you, Charles, for joining us and giving us a perspective of someone who is more familiar with the situation closer to the Sahel. So once again, thank you so much, and we look forward to talking to you again.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
You've heard quite a bit from our guests.
Yep.
What do you make of the view expressed by Charles, which I suspect is closer to the view which you hold,
Definitely.
that ECOWAS really is part of the problem in this context?
Yes, and it's one of the reasons why you ask yourself, if Africa, former colonies of European superpowers, then why the Caribbean and other former colonies of European superpowers? And then you think to yourself, well, the regional bodies constructed in these regions post-independence haven't done much to really serve the interests of the people living on the continent, but more so to serve foreign interests and business relationships that seek to, one, exploit African nationals or citizens within African states, and also exploit mineral and resources from these states. And then that becomes a wider issue in terms of leadership and governance, with them enriching themselves, as we've seen in Gabon.
Is ECOWAS's attempt to return the democratically elected power to Niger, is it them really trying to maintain stability in wider Africa? Because bear in mind, many of these coups occurred in quick succession. So is this really an attempt by ECOWAS to prevent this coup from spreading to their own territories and perhaps challenging their own power? So is it them wanting to protect stability or to protect themselves? Because as Andrew said, and as Mr. Ajiman had said, ECOWAS really does not serve the interests of West African states, and it seems to us, it seems to be supporting the interests of Western nations. So that's my take on them as well.
Okay, so
and also, as it relates to democracy, democracy seems to have failed many of these people in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Gabon. Democracy has failed them, and which is why they have overthrown all of their democratically elected leaders.
Quickly, gentlemen, I want to pose a question to you guys. Which seems more Pan-African in essence to you, ECOWAS or the military juntas seeking to form that alliance, basically of the states that have coup d'etats in the past? Which seems more Pan-African? Would you say? Which one is a question? So which one of them seem more Pan-African, ECOWAS or the alliance formed by the Sahel states?
But the question is legitimacy. In order for these states to be successful, they need to gain some form of legitimacy from the countries that control the international economic order. And I don't see them gaining that anytime soon. I don't see that happening significantly because it's not in the interest of these global powers to promote that.
Which global powers, as we'll discuss further on, I believe, or which global powers will they be aligning to is the more important question.
Yeah. Well, to help us in that discussion, we will be joined, of course, by one of our eminent political scientists, Clinton Hutton, in a few seconds. But I wanted to take you back to the whole issue of a legitimacy in the context of the people themselves, and reflect on the speech that was delivered recently in the UN General Assembly by the President of Guinea, in which he called for the rest of the world, to especially the Western world, to show a higher regard for the decision making of African governments and African societies themselves. And I'm not sure if you listened to that speech, but it echoed aspects of this very same Pan-Africanist set of ideas that would have been articulated by Kwame Nkrumah, etc. Do you think that we are witnessing certainly across the Sahel region and other parts of West Africa, a sort of a movement towards, towards that broader Pan-Africanist vision, and might I say across Africa? Is this a process that we're witnessing?
I smiled a bit whenever the situation became a case where they wanted to form that military alliance with each other for invasion from ECOWAS states, because it indicates to me that the notion of Pan-Africanism has returned. But my only hope is that these military juntas can organize themselves enough to actually lead these countries in an effective manner, rather than creating the same issues that they were built to prevent.
One of the major challenges is a leader is a revolutionary, for example, overthrowing a government and then adopting many of the same characteristics that government adopted. And that is one of the major challenges of the frequency of these coups. Will they end up just becoming like the leader that they replaced? And that's something that we also have to watch. And that's the danger of the frequency of all these coups.
Well, as I said, hopefully Clinton Hutton, who is about to join us, and who have spent a lot of time thinking about these things, will comment on, but I want to hear your take on that.
No, history serves as our biggest friend in this situation, in the case where how many successful military juntas have actually ruled an African state effectively in the past. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that these states face right now, and that is organizing themselves to have an efficient public bureaucracy, and also not good governance, but effective governance, in the sense of African citizens can now gain from leadership rather than succumbing to the same issues that they've been facing with these multinational corporations exploiting the land and exploiting the people. So as long as they can organize themselves economically so that the people can benefit, and politically as well, so that there can be a sense of stability in these states, then I think they should serve just fine.
Okay. Just as an aside, what do you think about the Gabon situation? I know Gabon, many people have been arguing that the situation is slightly different. Would you like to make any comments on Gabon?
Very interesting. As I previously said, in the past 50 years, it's been only two leaders from the same family. So I would like to propose the argument that this coup in Gabon is a just coup, because it presents the downfall of an extremely corrupt family. By the way, the Bongo family, I believe, they took 18% of all oil exports for themselves. And in fact, when Bongo was ousted, he made an impassioned plea from all the friends of Gabon to make noise, I believe he said, while sitting in an opulent style study. So, of course, most of the people in Gabon cannot afford the kind of lifestyle that he does. So I present the notion that was a just coup, and I think many of them are just coups.
I think the difference persons are pointing out is the one coups forming to expel the presence of the French, and the Gabonese coup basically being to expel the Bongo family, right? This dynastic rule, and how much, but just the same, it has the French remnants in the rule of the Bongo individuals, because the reason for them wanting to expel the French is the argument African or military juntas have made that these leaders have been puppets of French colonial rule. So the Bongo family serves as another example of that, but it's different in the sense of they don't necessarily want to expel French troops from Gabon, but they really and truly want a greater alternation in power rather than this royal or this monarchy or this dynastic rule that we've seen in the past couple of decades in Gabon, really.
Okay. Well, this has certainly been an enthralling discussion. I think we'll hear more on Gabon and certainly about the situation in not only in the Sahel but other parts of Africa. From our guest, our second guest, Professor Clinton Hutton, and I'm sure he will have much to say on this matter. Okay, so welcome back. We are joined by Clinton Hutton, who is a professor at the University of the West Indies, someone who has been studying the issue of African societies for a very, very long time. He's a professor of political thought and aesthetics. And Clinton, welcome. I know you have some very strong views on what we've been witnessing in the Sahel region recently, as someone who's been an observer for many, many years. So give us your view on your take on what has been happening thus far, and what are some of the implications for not only Africa but for the world, given what has happened in the Sahel so far.
Yeah, well, what has been happening has a deep, long history to it. History of French colonialism, which actually began in the Caribbean and which began, I think, with Haiti, and the lessons the French learned from Haiti are the lessons being used by the French in the Sahel region of Africa today. Colonialism and enslavement, of course, were not systems of democracy. They were dictatorships. Colonialism is a dictatorship. Slavery, which is a form of colonialism, is a dictatorship. And therefore, when slavery ended, and when the more colonial form of oppression took shape after during the post-slavery period, what happened is that the French or the British or the colonial, whatever the colonial power is at the time, wanted to live and not leave, but to ensure that their interest will be carried over by the new set of rulers, native rulers. And therefore, what is important is that the native rulers, the extent to which they abide by new colonial policies to carry on the legacy of colonialism, to carry on the legacy of the French in relation to the military, political, economic and cultural establishment of say, Niger or the other countries. What the interest is, the extent to which these will be carried out, whether by a democracy or by the form of a coup, right? So if the democracy is producing what the former colonial power wants, then there's no problem with that democracy, all right? And if the democracy is doing the opposite, I mean, Kwame Nkrumah from the British, Ghana, was involved. He was elected to power. He was removed by a coup d'etat. Patrice Lumumba was elected to power. Patrice Lumumba, just about 3 months after, was murdered. They dissolved him in sulfuric acid. And the person who took power after that coup d'etat ruled for 32 years. So nothing is wrong once that power, that new ruler or ruling elite, once they are doing the bidding of the former colonial power, then that is okay. And we can extend it across the world. Chile, Salvador Allende came to power. He has never sought another way of seeking power, but by electoral means in Chile. But he was for for Chileans to have access to and benefit from their natural resources. Copper, for example. And what happened? He was removed by a coup d'etat organized by the United States with the Chilean military. The leadership that they could find, they bombed the presidential palace and they killed Salvador Allende and they killed thousands of Chileans after. Even though he was in a democracy and promoting a democracy. So we must be very clear. The history of coup d'etat in Africa, therefore, is a history, let us state the French, is a history, for example, in which the organized native French military, I'm talking about Africans who became part of the French military in these former colonies. And these African soldiers organized by the French were used not just in those countries, in the Sahel region of Africa, but were also used outside of Africa to promote French interest in the French Empire.
But let me ask you, what has changed? There's been a lot of talk about a multipolar world.
Yes.
We've seen the emergence of BRICS, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But really, what has changed? Because we've had coups before in many parts of the world, in South America, of course, in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
There've been quite a few. So what is it about what we've seen recently within the last 3 years in the Sahel region that might suggest that something has changed or is changing? And if so, if indeed we agree that this is a change, as Akeem and Andrew have indicated, then what is that specific thing that has changed? And where might it take us?
Yeah, what has changed is the global balance of forces. That's the first thing. There's a permissive world context which gave rise to within the armed forces of these countries a more progressive. Not that it was not there. That tendency was always there. The tendency that led Sankara to become president of Upper Volta, changed to become Burkina Faso, who was assassinated. The other side of coups is really assassinations. I mean, the Europeans, they do not fail to remove people, whether they come by coup or election, to remove them from the seat. But the regime of coups was started by the Europeans. Let us be very clear. It's not an African thing. It was started by the Europeans, by the armed forces that they created in those countries. We have had it in Jamaica too, not coup. But we have, for example, we have had the West Indian regiments. The West Indian regiments were used to put down anti-slavery uprising in Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean. In Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago, these soldiers were bought off the slave markets by the British government, and they were trained to put down anti-slavery uprisings. And beyond that, they were also sent to Africa. In today's Ghana, for example, black Jamaicans who were formerly enslaved were sent to install British rule in what was then called the Gold Coast, right? And later, they were also sent to South Africa in the Boer War. So we must be very clear. In Jamaica, the West India Regiment was used in the Morant Bay Uprising of 1865, right? And there are writings about that, right? So we have a historical picture of what the use of the victims of enslavement that were used. And this is this context too that you should see. Certainly I see some of the forces in ECOWAS within this context. The same context in which Africans were used to enslave Africans in the trade across the Caribbean, this part of the world, the Americas, right? So it's no different. But the global context that gave more voice and inspiration for progressives to get rid of elites, and if not elites, immediate leaders who have ruled countries for ages, some of them. I mean, in the case of Gabon, 56 years, they're about almost 70 years, almost 60 years, right? And there was no quarrel from the so-called West about these leaders, right? There was no quarrel at all. There was no quarrel over the assassination of Sankara. And the person who led this assassination regime became one of the richest person, if not the richest person, in Burkina Faso. He was chased out after about 28 years in power, right? So the war in Ukraine is having a very profound impact on the shaping of Africa in terms of forces coming to the fore and not now being afraid to speak out.
So
That Africa, yes.
on that point, Clinton, what
Yeah.
I'd like to know is how do you feel about the presence of China in Eastern Africa? Are the Russian forces supporting those in Mali and elsewhere, or in Niger?
Yes.
How do you feel about the presence of them specifically, as this was multipolarity?
Yes, I think the import of them in those spaces is important. I think people should not come to the conclusion that, although they will, you cannot stop people from coming up, but you need to look at history and what history has given to us, right? In the national liberation struggles of the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, a critical force that Africa could rely, African liberation movements were able to rely on was the Soviet Union. They rely on the Soviet Union for training of fighters against the apartheid regime in South Africa, against those in those forces that supported the Portuguese in Angola, in Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and those other places. And of course, they also trained members of the Patriotic Front in China, all right, in Eastern Europe, and so on, right? So that was important, that if the people needed arms, if they were being perpetually suppressed, they can't fight with their fingers, right? And in fact, many people die heroically in a way in which they knew that they were going to be defeated. It happens on the plantation in the Caribbean as well, right? So Was the Soviet Union therefore crucial in that period of national liberation that brought independence to those states that were colonized? Yes.
Yes, and I agree with you.
Yes.
But I want to ask you, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, wouldn't you find it dangerous for African states to outright
Yes.
state their support for Russia in Ukraine in this current climate, especially with globalized economies?
Well, I don't think that the position of most of those African states is not say we do this and we do that in terms of direct support.
Yes.
They are calling for non-alignment. They are calling for all of those things, but it has also given them a bigger voice. Listen to even moderate figures who are now speaking out in Africa that we want our resources, right? And that we want a fair deal, and that we abhor these sanctions. Right? There is, the Ugandan leader is no, he has been there long ago, for a long while and so on. But he is speaking out. He's speaking out against what happened to Gaddafi and Libya. What happened in Libya? One of the main reasons for the problem of insurgency in the Sahel was because of what the United States under Barack Obama did to the Libyan people. It is that. And so what happened? Those moderate, that they call them, to get people to support them, global support, those moderates are those people who are fighting insurgency to disrupt these societies, right? Boko Haram, all of those. Plus, the other side of it is that some of these governments in Africa, they do not attend to their young people. And therefore, some of their young people will be won to fight insurgency. That is not necessarily beneficial to them. Or they could be misguided as well. But it can't be seen that, well, they are just bad people born this way and need to be wiped off the face of the earth. We need to see how the United States and European power, who are talking high and mighty about democracy and the values of democracy, how they poison young people and use them as cannon fodder for their own interest. Just like they're talking about, they will go to this thing to the last Ukrainian.
Okay, well, gentlemen, this is a very enthralling, intriguing, exciting discussion. And I think it takes us into another aspect of this broader discussion about what is happening in the Sahel region. And I'm sure we're going to revisit it. At this point, I would really like to thank Clinton Hutton for joining us. As usual, he brings many years of experience and knowledge about the region. So Clinton, thank you very much. Let me say that at this point, we will certainly invite you back to continue this conversation. And we hope that many of those kernels of knowledge and wisdom of observing what has been happening globally for many, many years will be expressed. So we're going to take a very short break, and then we will join with our two co-hosts, Andrew and Akeem, and we'll come to some takeaways from this discussion today. Okay, so we've just heard from two experts, persons who have been observing the situation in the Sahel, one from near, one from afar, but both of them have clearly expressed views which very often run counter to a sort of a narrative that you might see in the Western media. What do you make of the view, both of you make of the view expressed by Clinton, that one must locate what we see in the Sahel within a larger understanding of what has happened historically to Africa and its relationship with Europe and in the whole decolonization process. I don't know, Akim, you want to go first?
I think he's very much correct. Um, it this entire display, it just demonstrates the fact that whenever countries try to break away from Europe, they are generally met with stiff resistance. Um, I want to point, for example, towards the cooperation agreements signed between France and many of their former colonies in the late 1950s. Now, though that wasn't stiff resistance, as I previously mentioned, it is an example of France trying to maintain the power and influence that it has always had in Africa. And so my opinion is that the relationship, at least from the purview of the Europeans, the relationship between Europe and Africa is one that is always going to be one of imbalance, one in which the Europeans try to take advantage of what Africa has to offer in any regard.
So, what would you say is your one takeaway from the discussion for today?
My one takeaway, well, I have many takeaways, but I suppose
The most critical one.
the most critical takeaway that I have is that all of these coups demonstrates the African people fighting out against the predatory relationships between them and France, because the relationship is indeed predatory. You see that from the 1958 cooperation agreements, and you see that in many instances of active sabotage between these countries. I can point you towards Guinea, for example, when they tried to establish their own currency and their own central bank in the 1960s. The French flooded their markets with counterfeit currencies. In all of these instances, the ridiculous conditions that all of these African countries, I read recently that Mali has completely turned their back on all of these agreements that they have with Africa. Like, for example, France's right to first refusal of all minerals. So they have the right to buy them first. French corporations and firms have the right of first refusal to all public works. So, for example, African countries have to go to French entities first before they build anything public. The fact that many of these African countries have to store over 50% of their foreign reserves in the French National Treasury. So my main takeaway, the relationship between France and these countries, these ex-colonies, is extremely predatory, and these people have simply had enough of it. And that is why they're ousting their leaders that are supported by France.
Okay.
Yeah, to support basically the point that Clinton raised earlier about placing the activities in the Sahel region in a broader African context in terms of decolonization. I always pose the question, what exactly is decolonization?
Mm-hmm.
How do you return to African antiquity? How do you return to traditional African politics? And the answer is you can't, basically. And that creates a dilemma for the people in Africa in the sense of trying to retrieve that notion of traditional African politics, but at the same time not knowing what that looks like in the sense of being too far removed from those traditional political processes, and also being forced to live amongst ethnic groups that you never shared a political system with in the past in terms of antiquity. Now, I want to place it in my takeaway as well in terms of the broader context of democracy, in the sense of there is an irony of democracy, which is my main takeaway from today's discussion, in the sense of you have these European countries, and especially in these big studies talking about waves of democratization, pointing them as democracy, but yet still, even though they're considered as democratic countries, your France, your Britain, the US, they still maintain colonies across the world that, as Professor Unad said, these are dictatorships. Colonialism is dictatorship. So I want to support that by saying that our notion of democracy and decolonization is completely textbook. And because it's textbook, we have this idea of what democracy should look like. And that simply means that one, you have two maintenance. You have legitimacy, and so far, I see the military junta with enough popular support versus what I've seen for elected leaders in Africa. So legitimacy, we can check that off the list. And then you have accountability Whereas these military juntas are placing themselves in a position to be held accountable by the people in terms of transitionary periods of government where they promise election dates, as you see in Mali, or they promise to reform the constitution in such a way that is beneficial to the African citizens. So if we can check the boxes on those two tenets of democracy, why can't we consider a military junta democratic?
And I would just like to point something out, if I may. The democracy that is often spoke about in the West and encouraged is a different form of democracy, as Andrew just said. So, for example, in Gabon, which, let's just be honest, was nothing close to a democracy. Many of those elections were just election in name only, and they were supported by the French for close to half a century. So the French, they support the elected leaders when the elected leaders are in line with the French national interest. And not just the French. We speak about the French because they're French, ex-French colonies, but the West as a whole. Whenever someone, as Professor Hutton stated, whenever someone presents policies that are contrary to the national interest of Western governments, they mysteriously die, they mysteriously disappear. They just, something bad always happens to them. So it's democracy for the French, really, not democracy for them.
My takeaway basically is that we are witnessing a change in Africa. And it's a change unlike anything that has happened before. As our guest indicated, Africa is going through what I call a second phase of decolonization. And this second phase is different in the sense that we have, as has been said by Clinton Hutton, we have a world that is more multipolar in the sense that the strength of the West is no longer what it was in the 60s, in the 50s and the 60s, when the decolonization process started for these countries. So added to that is again something he mentioned, which is that we have a continent which has the largest proportion of young people of any continent in the world. And these young people want change. They want something different. They want something that was not achieved by their parents and grandparents. And they are prepared to take whatever risks that are necessary to bring about this change. So we have a confluence of factors. We have a situation in Ukraine. You have the emergence of BRICS, which reflects a change in multipolarity of the world. We have a young continent, and we have a new view or feeling of what it means to be free in African society. So we have a sort of resurgence of Pan-Africanism, which I'm sure Kwame Nkrumah and many others, Bob Marley, so many other leaders, Sankara, etc., Lumumba, would be certainly proud of. We don't know where this will take us, but we expect that change will continue across the continent. As Professor Amajiman said from Ghana, ECOWAS is not on the same page as the people of their countries. And so we see a clash between what ostensibly is an ECOWAS position, which says that we should restore power to West African countries, and the people who say that is not enough. Democracy means more than that, has been expressed by our guest. So again, we wait to see the outcome, and we wait to see what will happen across the African continent. But rest assured that we are entering into a new era. Africa is not what it used to be. It is an emerging continent, and certainly we expect that it will be the future of the world. So I want to end by thanking all of my guests who have joined us on Global Conversations. Be sure to send us feedback on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We invite you to become a subscriber on our channel and comment on what you've heard here. Until we meet again next week, remain curious. Goodbye for now.